Mount Everest rises above the clouds, its snow-covered slopes a symbol of ultimate triumph. But this mountain also claims lives without mercy. In this video, we're uncovering 6 horrifying Everest accidents ever, each a reminder that the world's tallest peak is also its most fatal one. It was May 22, 2015, high on the slopes of Mount Everest. The sky was clear, but the air thin. The summit ridges whipped by winds invisible from below. Climbers moved slowly in single file, bundled against the cold, but each step carried hidden danger. Elena Petrova was 34, a schoolteacher from Moscow. Known among her colleagues as quiet and disciplined, she spent most of her free time training. She ran long distances through city parks and practiced on indoor climbing walls, determined to build the strength for an expedition few in her circle thought possible. Though cautious by nature, she saw Everest as a test of endurance and perseverance. The trip was partly funded by a small cultural foundation that encouraged Russian educators to pursue extraordinary goals, and she saw her climb as a way to inspire her students. Climbing Everest relied on meticulous planning. Oxygen cylinders and regulators allowed climbers to function in the death zone, where air was too thin to sustain life for long. Sherpa guides, the high-altitude workers native to the Everest region, carried spares, but the margin for error was slim. Regulators froze, valves jammed, and bottles occasionally ran dry earlier than expected. Above 28,000 feet, even a short interruption in flow could trigger rapid decline. Elena knew the risks, but trusted the systems in place and the experience of her guides. The push for the summit began in darkness. Headlamps dotted the ridge as teams moved slowly upward. Elena had reached the south summit by late morning, only a few hundred feet below the top. The altitude was punishing, each breath shallow despite the hiss of her regulator. Other climbers later testified she appeared strong but moved with noticeable strain. The winds gusted more violently than forecast, forcing several expeditions to turn back. Her team pressed on, but conditions made every pause more dangerous. Near the south summit, Elena slowed sharply. Witnesses recalled her stumbling, her movements jerky and uneven. Her regulator sputtered, the flow breaking in short bursts, and she tore at her mask in panic. She dropped to one knee, gasping violently, her body sagging as if drained in seconds. Guides nearby rushed to her side, signaling for an oxygen swap. In the thin air, her lips darkened almost immediately, her gloved hands clawing weakly at the snow as she tried to stay upright. A Sherpa clipped in a new cylinder and adjusted the valve, but she did not recover. She slumped forward, twitching briefly before going still. The fresh regulator hissed steadily, but her chest no longer rose. Climbers in line behind waited in silence, pinned by the narrow ridge. Rescue efforts lasted several minutes. Guides tried shaking her shoulders, lifting her upright, and forcing the mask into place, but she gave no sign of response. The cold wind swept spindrift across her form as climbers reluctantly moved past. The narrow terrain made recovery impossible, and her body remained on the route, wrapped in snow. On Everest, bodies are often left where climbers fall, the cost and danger of retrieval too great above 8,000 meters. Elena's body remained on the route, wrapped in snow by the winds. In Moscow, her school assembly turned into an emotional tribute, students reading letters she had written from Nepal. Her climbing club, in contrast, spoke bluntly about faulty regulators and urged members to check gear more rigorously. Nepalese officials filed her death with no public remark. It was April 27, 2016, in the Khumbu Icefall on the south side of Mount Everest. Dozens of climbers threaded their way across ladders and ropes. Everything looked steady, but the icefall's reputation as the most dangerous section of the mountain lingered in every footstep. Priya Sharma was 29 years old, a finance analyst from New Delhi. She had discovered climbing only 5 years earlier through weekend treks in Himachal Pradesh, quickly building a reputation among her friends for her determination. Reserved at work but confident in the mountains, she saved aggressively, channeling much of her earnings into guided expeditions. By 2016, she had summited smaller Himalayan peaks such as Stok Kangri and Island Peak, gradually preparing herself for Everest. Her decision was not impulsive. It was the culmination of years of planning and sacrifice. She was an amateur, but disciplined. She trained in endurance running, spent evenings on climbing walls, and joined Indian mountaineering groups to gain credibility. Though she had no major sponsors, she received equipment discounts from a Delhi outdoor gear retailer in exchange for photos. She told colleagues Everest would be her milestone before turning 30. The risk was real, but she convinced herself that preparation, guides, and discipline would bridge the gap between experience and the mountain's demands. The Khumbu icefall demanded precise movement. Climbers navigated aluminum ladders tied across deep crevasses, secured by ropes anchored into shifting ice. Each step was deliberate, crampon points catching the thin metal rungs. Safety required double clips to the rope, but even then, sudden shifts could overwhelm the system. Sherpas moved swiftly here, but for less seasoned climbers, it was a place where confidence could falter. That morning, her team moved into the icefall early to avoid daytime warming. The section ahead had drawn concern. 3 ladders lashed together across a wide gap, sagging under their own weight. Guides urged climbers to move slowly and in rhythm. A few had hesitated, remarking on the creaking of the ladders and the visible darkness of the crevasse beneath. Yet the expedition pressed forward. Priya clipped her harness, but witnesses later noted that one of her carabiners had not been fully secured to the main line. She stepped onto the ladder cautiously at first, then, as others watched, quickened her pace. Halfway across, her crampon slipped deep between the rungs with a metallic snap. The ladder buckled, swaying violently. Priya lurched forward, arms flailing, her scream tearing through the still air. Her right clip caught, jerking her sideways, but the improperly clipped carabiner slid free under strain. In an instant, the rope went slack. Her body pitched off the ladder, slamming against the side rail before dropping into the void. The hollow crash of metal echoed, followed by the sight of her vanishing into blackness. Climbers froze in place, voices calling her name. One Sherpa scrambled to the edge, only to see fragments of ice collapsing where she had struck the wall on the way down. The sound of crampons scraping ice carried upward and then cut off sharply. After that, nothing. The team waited, still clipped in, shaken. Attempts to lower a rope revealed no purchase. The crevasse was too deep and unstable, and ice cracked under minimal tension. The guides made the decision to retreat. Her fall had been witnessed by at least 6 climbers on the same ladder section, close enough to see the failure clearly. Like many who perish on Everest, her body could not be recovered, as retrieval is often too dangerous and costly in such terrain. Her family in Delhi held a quiet prayer ritual in their apartment, away from media attention. Among mountaineers, the accident became a technical talking point. Climbers circulated diagrams of the ladder set up online, criticizing rushed crossings. No authority weighed in directly. It was May 21st, 2016, high on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest. Dozens of climbers were strung out along the ridge, inching forward in the thin air. By the time the sun rose higher, one climber would collapse in full view of others and never move again. Liu Fang was 42 years old, from Chengdu, China. A dedicated marathon runner, she had built her reputation through long-distance races across Asia before turning to mountaineering in her late 30s. Colleagues described her as disciplined and methodical, balancing her banking career with intense training schedules. Friends said she saw Everest as proof that years of self-control and fitness could carry her to a new arena. Her entry into mountaineering was recent but determined. She climbed in Sichuan's high ranges and joined organized expeditions to Cho Oyu and Manaslu, gaining limited high-altitude experience. By 2016, she secured a place with a Chinese commercial expedition on Everest, supported by a regional sports foundation and local sponsors who provided gear. She trained with oxygen systems at home and studied acclimatization schedules. Her experience gave her confidence, though she had never before pushed into the death zone above 26,000 feet. That morning's climb was more dangerous than most anticipated. Forecasts warned of strengthening winds later in the day. but expedition leaders decided to continue, aiming to summit before conditions deteriorated. The route was crowded, with more than 100 climbers pushing for the top. Delays at fixed ropes created bottlenecks, forcing climbers to stand still in the cold, burning oxygen. Some guides voiced concern that slower members risked exhaustion, but no one wanted to turn back so close to the goal. By the time Liu reached near the south summit, her pace had dropped sharply. Witnesses described her movements as labored, each step followed by a pause. Her mask was in place, but the sound of her coughing carried even through the wind. A fellow climber noted the wet, rattling tone, consistent with high-altitude pulmonary edema. Despite the signs, she pressed on, driven by the summit in sight only a short climb above. She vomited into the snow, streaks of blood marking the ice at her knees. Climbers behind her watched as she clawed at the slope, trying to rise, but her coordination failed. Guides attempted to encourage her to move, but she collapsed fully, her arms splayed. She gasped irregularly, then went completely limp, her chest no longer rising. The oxygen mask slid aside, frosting quickly in the cold. Efforts to lift her were futile. At that altitude, physical exhaustion and the slope's narrowness made sustained rescue impossible. The line of climbers stalled, some waiting in silence, while others stepped around her body, clipped to the fixed rope. Multiple climbers later confirmed her final moments, seeing her collapse against the ridge before the line resumed its slow push toward the summit. Within minutes, frost and rime quickly formed on her clothing and hair in the harsh wind, rather than snow drifting across her. Her body remained high on the ridge, too dangerous to remove. In Chengdu, her running partners staged a silent lap around their training track, leaving flowers at the finish line. Meanwhile, Chinese mountaineering collectives argued fiercely over whether her guides should have turned her back earlier, with the debate eclipsing any formal government statement. It was April 28, 2017, in Nepal's Khumbu Icefall, just above base camp on the route to Mount Everest. Climbers at Camp Y had begun settling into tents, believing they had a few hours of rest before continuing their acclimatization. The sound of the ice fall was never quiet, but on that morning it carried an edge, groaning and shifting. Hannah Collins was 31, an outdoor instructor from Manchester, England. She had spent nearly a decade leading school groups and private clients across the Alps and Scottish Highlands, building a reputation for patience and careful guidance. She often spoke about the satisfaction of seeing her students push beyond their comfort zones. Everest was not part of her work, but her own ambition, a chance to prove she could stand among the highest peaks she had long taught others to respect. Her climb was financed through savings and modest sponsorship from a UK outdoor clothing company she had worked with during training courses. The support was limited but symbolic, reinforcing her image as both a professional guide and committed mountaineer. Hannah was skilled in rope systems, avalanche awareness, and crevasse rescue. Yet Everest's icefall posed challenges far beyond her usual terrain. The labyrinth of towers and unstable ice blocks required aluminum ladders strung across chasms and constant movement through areas known for collapses. On that day, the risk was higher than most realized. Warm temperatures the afternoon before had loosened parts of the glacier, and Sherpas voiced concern about traversing so late in the morning. Still, the expedition pressed on, aiming to establish acclimatization at Camp 1. By mid-morning, tents were being pitched and climbers unpacked stoves when the first sharp cracks echoed across the slope, sounding closer and sharper than usual. Some dismissed the sounds as distant seracs breaking, but a few grew uneasy, scanning the slopes above. Suddenly, a massive block of ice sheared off from a higher serac, plummeting with a deafening roar. Snow and shattered ice exploded outward, carrying a blast of wind that knocked tents askew. Hannah, kneeling by her tent tightening a guy line, had no time to react. A jagged fragment struck her shoulder, spinning her against the tent pole before she was slammed into the snow. Heavy ice blocks and dense snow slammed down around her in a chaotic surge, burying her instantly. Dusty snow filled the air, and visibility dropped to near zero. Climbers around her were thrown off balance, some diving behind debris, while others were dragged along by the force of the collapse. Screams echoed through the cloud of ice and powder. When the noise settled and the snow drifted briefly aside, several tents were crushed and climbers shaken. Rescue efforts began immediately, guided by shouts and avalanche probes. Hannah was uncovered hours later, motionless beneath fragmented ice and compressed snow. The size and weight of the blocks had left no chance of survival, and her injuries indicated blunt trauma from the impact rather than burial alone. Her funeral in Manchester was attended by dozens of former students who remembered her guidance. On the mountain, climbers built a small stone cairn at Camp 1 in her honor, a fragile gesture soon swallowed by shifting snow. Nepalese authorities, meanwhile, issued a brisk weather advisory, treating the avalanche as an expected hazard rather than an avoidable tragedy. It was May 21st, 2018, on the northeast ridge of Mount Everest. Climbers moved in single file, headlamps still visible in the early light, their progress slowed by the thinning atmosphere. The ridge was narrow, with sheer drops on either side. Sofia Andersson was 27, a graduate student from Gothenburg, Sweden. She was pursuing advanced studies in environmental physiology and had built her identity around endurance. Marathons, long-distance cycling, and winter treks had all filled her years leading up to this climb. Friends described her as disciplined, but eager to prove herself in physical extremes. Everest represented a personal milestone, a way to blend her academic interest in human limits with a feat she hoped would define her 20s. Her place on the international expedition was funded largely through her own savings, though she had received discounted equipment from a Swedish company outdoor brand interested in using her story for marketing. For Sofia, the climb was less about sponsorship and more about validation, though she admitted to colleagues that the pressure to succeed added weight. The climb itself demanded specialized gear, oxygen systems, insulated boots with crampons, and harnesses clipped to fixed ropes. On the northeast ridge, climbers faced steep exposed sections where fatigue and thin air magnified every error. The final push that morning was unusually risky. Wind forecasts had been marginal, with gusts predicted to rise by midday. Yet the team pressed on in order to reach the summit window before the season closed. Above 27,000 feet, every step was slow, each breath labored even with oxygen. Several Sherpas had urged climbers to stay close, warning that prolonged stops could be dangerous. Despite these cautions, Sofia appeared restless, moving in ways that unsettled those behind her. Witnesses later described the change as gradual. At first, she slowed, pausing with her hands on her knees. Then she began muttering, her words uneven. Instead of laughing, she tugged repeatedly at her gloves and harness, her hands trembling, ignoring calls from teammates to keep them on. The team leader called for her to clip into the fixed line properly, but she swayed and stepped sideways near the ridge's edge. Her behavior quickly shifted from fatigue to confusion. She wandered a few feet off the main path, smiling faintly but unsteady, her movements lacking coordination. She stumbled once, caught herself, then wavered again. Climbers shouted for her to stop. One Sherpa lunged forward, but within a heartbeat she slipped and her body dropped away over the edge. In a final moment, those watching saw her vanish instantly, the fall abrupt and final, her figure swallowed by the void below. Search efforts were impossible. The cliff beneath the ridge was sheer and inaccessible, with debris falling constantly. Sherpas secured the area, but no trace of her could be reached. The team descended in silence, shaken by the suddenness of what they had witnessed. Later accounts from climbers confirmed her erratic movements and final fall, offering stark evidence of altitude-induced disorientation. Her remains were never recovered from the cliffs. In Gothenburg, her university held a seminar where doctors explained the neurological effects of hypoxia, framing her death less as a personal failing than a physiological inevitability. Fellow students wept quietly in the audience, while climbing operators in Tibet mentioned her case only in technical briefings about oxygen use. It was May 23, 2018, on the South Col route of Mount Everest. The thin line of climbers moved slowly above the Hillary Step, their progress stalled by a bottleneck. Each minute spent waiting drained energy and burned precious oxygen. Maria Torres, 36, came from Madrid, Spain. She worked as an accountant for a logistics firm, though her free time was spent outdoors. She was known for her discipline, often hiking long trails in the Pyrenees or traveling to South America for high-altitude treks. Friends described her as organized and determined, the type who approached challenges with steady planning. Everest had been her goal for years, representing both a personal achievement and a way of proving her resilience. Her climb was arranged through a large commercial outfitter, which had secured permits for dozens of clients. Maria carried standard gear, insulated down suit, double-layered boots with crampons, and an oxygen system with spare bottles managed by Sherpa support. The South Col route was crowded that season, with climbers funneling through fixed ropes on narrow ridges. Even experienced mountaineers had little control over pace when stuck behind slower teams, and the risk of delays was well known. On summit day, Maria began her push shortly after midnight. Conditions were marginal but considered manageable. Forecasts had warned of increasing winds by afternoon, but guides urged teams to move quickly and seize the summit window before it closed. By dawn, she had reached the balcony, slower than some but still steady. As she climbed higher, however, the line of climbers grew denser. By the time she reached the ridge near the Hillary Step, traffic slowed to a crawl. The bottleneck stretched for hours. Climbers reported shuffling forward a few steps before waiting again, oxygen masks fogging as their bottles drained faster than planned. Maria was seen leaning heavily on her poles, conserving energy, but her pace slowed further. Sherpas urged her to stay alert and continue moving, yet the queue left little room to maneuver. Above 28,000 feet, time spent standing still became as dangerous as climbing itself. As the hours dragged on, her condition worsened. Witnesses described her face turning pale beneath her goggles, lips darkening. She swayed, knees buckling, and at one point slumped forward onto her pack. A Sherpa clipped her securely to the rope and tried to rouse her, shaking her shoulder. She opened her eyes briefly, but could not rise. Other climbers, pressed by the narrow path, were forced to step around her. Moments later, her decline turned sudden. Without warning, she jerked upright, her body convulsing, then collapsed violently sideways against the fixed rope. Her mask tore free, the hiss of escaping oxygen loud in the thin air. Her head struck the ice with a hollow thud, and her limbs twitched before going rigid. Sherpas rushed to replace her body, but her chest no longer moved. Within minutes, frost began to form on her open lips. At that altitude, further effort was impossible. She had succumbed where she fell, her body left seated and slumped against the rope as the line of climbers edged past. Her funeral in Madrid was subdued. Her body left on the mountain as recovery was impossible. Spanish newspapers ran brief but pointed editorials linking her death to overcrowding, framing it as a systemic problem rather than an individual miscalculation. Nepalese officials stayed silent at the time, but among Sherpa guides, her name was spoken with respect but also resignation. Another client lost to forces they could not control. Thanks for watching. If these stories of extreme adventures turning sideways entertained you, click here for more.